Russian forces have entered Kyiv. The incursion followed this appeal from Vladimir Putin to the Ukrainian armed forces to overthrow their own government.
Once again, I appeal to the Ukrainian armed forces. Do not allow the neo-Nazis and Benderites to use your children, your wives, and old people as human shields. Take power into your own hands. Like that, it will be easier for us to come to an agreement than with that gang of druggies and neo-Nazis who have seized Kyiv and who are taking the entire Ukrainian people hostage.
It's currently being reported there is fighting between Russian and Ukrainian troops in the historic city centre of Kyiv, near to the location of the Ukrainian parliament, as well as the presidential office. This comes after last night, when Kyiv endured a barrage of missile attacks, and the Ukrainian Interior Ministry shared this footage of, according to them, the downing of a Russian jet over the city. This map shows how Russian troops approached the capital. As you can see, the Russians are moving in a pincer formation, moving from Belarus in the northwest and Russia in the northeast. By lunchtime, Russian forces were seen entering the northern suburb of Obolon. This footage from social media shows armoured vehicles moving through the largely residential area located just 9 kilometres north of the city centre. The Ministry of Defence's Facebook page urged citizens to defend the city as the Russians approached, posting, "We urge citizens to inform us of troop movements, to make Molotov cocktails, and to neutralise the enemy." And to that end, the Ukrainian government have been arming the citizens of Kyiv and calling for volunteer fighters. Speaking to CBS News, a 44-year-old recruit said, "This is my country, I have my family here, and I have a duty to protect my family and to protect my country. And this is the duty of each and every Ukrainian. We will fight as much as we can. We will fight because we have our families, our country, and our lifestyle that we are not ready to give up." As Ukrainian forces took up defensive positions around the city, many residents fled danger. At Kyiv's central railway station, shots were fired to disperse crowds. The Guardian have reported that 50,000 Ukrainians have fled the country in the last 48 hours. But speaking last night, President Zelensky vowed to stay in the city.
Today, I have asked 27 European leaders whether Ukraine will be in NATO. I have asked directly. Everyone is afraid. No one answers. But we are not afraid. We are not afraid of anything. We are not afraid to defend our country. We are not afraid of Russia. We are not afraid to talk to Russia. Sadly, today we lost 137 heroes, our citizens. 10 of them were officers. 316 people have been wounded. They have not surrendered. They will all be awarded posthumously the title of the Hero of Ukraine. Let those who gave their lives for Ukraine be remembered forever. I remain in the capital. My family is also in Ukraine. My children are in Ukraine. They are not traitors. They are citizens of Ukraine. According to the information we have, the enemy has marked me as target number 1, my family as target number 2. They want to damage Ukraine politically by destroying the head of state.
At present, the British Ministry of Defence estimates that 450 Russian soldiers have been killed, while there have been 194 Ukrainian fatalities, including 57 civilians. I'm joined now by Vladimir Ishchenko, a Ukrainian sociologist at the Free University of Berlin. Vladimir, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate it. I wanted to start the conversation actually by asking what you're hearing from friends and family in Ukraine at the moment.
What I hear from my relatives in Kyiv, many people are leaving, and there are problems to leave the city, huge traffic jams, and also the crowds, the central station that you've shown. But also, I think most people are staying, partially because they cannot leave, and they think it would be just dangerous right now, or they believe that the fights would end quite soon. Some part of them are ready to fight in the streets, and the street fight scenario would be, of course, like the horrible for the city.
It's a horrible choice to have to make. Do you leave? Do you stay and hope the fighting is short, or do you take up arms? And obviously, Zelensky at this point is very much encouraging people to stay and fight and to take up arms. What's your perspective on that decision on his part? I mean, on the one hand, obviously, these people have every justification and every right to do this. At the same time, a long guerrilla war could have appalling humanitarian costs.
Yeah, that's a difficult choice he has to make, and like we first we need to acknowledge that he is staying in the capital in Kyiv, and he doesn't leave the city because before the invasion started, I read some opinions that the only reason that Ukraine denies the probability of the invasion, as they actually do, that they would just take the flights from Kyiv in the first hours and leave the country, and they would betray it. And we need to acknowledge that the government is staying in Kyiv, and so far they are ready to lead the resistance. They are also ready to talk to Russia, but as probably know now, Russia is pushing for quite harsh demands to start the talks. And I'm not sure they were ready so far. And of course, the sooner the talks would start, the more lives would be saved and less destruction would be. The question, of course, would be about the military balance. Maybe Zelensky is indeed hoping for massive resistance. And today, so far, we've seen not so much advance by Russian troops, at least to the extent I could follow the news. The advance in the first day was much further and more territories occupied. And this day it looks like kind of like stagnation on many front lines, except of the advance to Kyiv. And it could be the first target they would want to take, and then maybe either to force the Ukrainian government to surrender or to install a pro-Russian government, and then hoping for surrendering the parts of Ukrainian military and other cities, so they would not. So that the Russian army would not need to assault them. But it's really really difficult to predict how the fights would continue.
Let's take a look at a map of, this is from the New York Times, sort of showing where the latest troop movements are. You can see here where they've got those little explosion signs, that's ground fighting or incursion. So all across the eastern border of the country, then also up from Crimea and then on Kiev. I suppose, looking at that map, are you pretty certain that Putin, and as I said at the beginning of this show, I really didn't expect this to happen. Do you think Putin wants to take the whole of Ukraine before any negotiations will begin?
I didn't expect this scenario, and like you, I expected rather different strategy, a gradual destabilization of Ukraine. And this is what Ukrainian intelligence expected, and this is what the Ukrainian government expected. And Putin was able to attack suddenly, despite all these talks about the imminent invasion for several months. He was able to actually to exploit this sudden moment. What he proclaimed at the goals of this, what he called an operation, is demilitarization, which means the destruction of Ukrainian military potential, and that's what they started to do in the first days with attacks on the military objects. But also denazification, and earlier Putin talked about decommunization in the speech on Monday. So he may tell you that the Russian army is not going to occupy Ukraine, but denazification cannot mean anything else as the kind of like regime change, installing a pro-Russian government, and that's what he talked today as well. That this gang of how he called them, like junkies and neo-Nazis should be just removed, and we need Russia needs to talk to the healthier part of Ukrainian society. And that means that they need to take Kyiv, they need to proclaim the new government, and to take control over a significant part of Ukraine. Dehumanization, which he mentioned on Monday, means a partition of Ukraine, with all that historical references saying that Lenin created the modern map of Ukraine, the modern borders of Ukrainian state. And dehumanization means that we are revising these borders. So it could be partition, it could be another structure for Ukrainian state, like confederation or federation. We'll see.
I presume at some point Putin is hoping that there is at least, some acceptance of whatever plan he has for Ukraine from the Ukrainian people, because otherwise this would just be a forever war. I mean, maybe he's willing to risk that. I imagine he probably is willing to risk that. But do you see any scenario where Putin gets some of what he wants and the Ukrainian population basically accept that? They say, well, this is better than war, so we'll go with what he wants. Can you see any scenario that fits that sort of narrative?
One scenario could be massive destruction and continuous immiseration when they're not ready for resistance. I actually don't think that in the southeastern Ukraine, the armed resistance to Russian army would take a massive scale. In Kyiv, it's more possible, but not in the cities like Odessa or Kharkov. But that armed resistance would be sufficient to make the new political regime in a potential pro-Russian Ukraine one of the most repressive in the whole post-Soviet space. And that would lead to unarmed resistance by larger social groups. It is indeed the problem which social group in Ukrainian society could even benefit anything from Russian occupation and from a pro-Russian government. And so this government would not have any legitimacy, any social base of support, and it would be inherently unstable. And furthermore, this instability would diffuse to Russia and Belarus as well, inspiring the local opposition. And of course, the more casualties Russian troops would suffer in Ukraine, the larger would be anti-war protests in Russia. We've seen them yesterday. They were not big, but of course that depends on how large casualties Russian army would suffer in Ukraine.
Lots of people are talking about, what demands can people outside of Ukraine make of their governments. Obviously, very specific if you're living in Russia. But for people living elsewhere, what kind of things would you be calling for outside governments to be doing in this situation?
We need to call for immediate talks. The sooner the talks starting, the more lives would be saved, the less destruction to Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian industry, Ukrainian economy would be made. That's the first thing, and the whole world need to call Russia to stop military actions and leave Ukrainian territory. That's the first thing to do. The way to force Russia, it's actually, I look very pessimistic on this. Some people call for switching them off from the SWIFT system. But I actually think they've been preparing to this since 2014. In 2014, when they annexed Crimea and started to support the separatists in Donbass, there have been talks about cutting off SWIFT, and they developed their own system. So I don't think that Russian banks would stop functioning. They've already prepared a solution. What else they can do? we've seen in the United States sanctions that they actually, they sanctioned the two biggest Russian banks, but they specifically allowed energy trade and another list of the most important Russian export. So it's actually this is like business as usual. They proclaim solidarity with Ukraine, but at the same time they're also thinking about the interests of the American and European corporations. And in this situation, it's just a feeling of desperation.